or this is more of a general introduction to the topic and the way it has historically developed, and also how research on the topic has developed. So there are two parts to my title and two parts to my talk. It is on the one hand about the history of conspiracy theories, which of course is quite ambitious for a 45-minute talk. So I'll also only give you bits and pieces and outline what I think are the most important developments, but also open questions that we still have there. And secondly, I will talk about the development of research on conspiracy theories. And as we will see, the two topics are related, because as research approaches have changed, our understanding of the history of the phenomenon has also developed. I would like to begin, however, with a short definition. Of course, no definition of conspiracy theory is entirely uncontested. However, as somebody who's also been working on populism for the past couple of years, I find that most of the definitions are fairly compatible with each other, unlike in populism studies where the nature of populism is very much contested. So for a talk like this definition by the American political scientist Michael Barkun comes in handy, who says conspiracy theories are characterized by three major assumptions. They claim that nothing happens by accident. In other words, they assume that everything has been planned. They secondly claim that nothing is as it seems. In other words, they assume that the really important things are happening in secret. The conspirators are operating in secret and pulling the strings from there. And they also assume that everything is connected, that there are links between people, institutions, events that you would not think possible, or that you only start to believe there really exist if you assume that there is a large-scale plot going on. For example, some people link the 5G technology to the current pandemic. This definition is largely compatible with another one that I quite like, and that was put forward by the British historian Jeff Cubitt, who in this book from the mid-1990s and in an article that he published a couple of years earlier also identifies three major ingredients or assumptions of conspiracy theories: intentionalism, occultism, and dualism. Now, intentionalism and occultism basically correspond to what Barkun means when he says nothing happens by accident and nothing is as it seems. Intentionalism also assumes that everything has been planned, and occultism assumes that everything that is important happens beneath the surface in secret. Where it becomes interesting, and this already kind of leads us into the topic of the historical development of conspiracy theories, is that Barkun, who also in other places highlights the Manichaean worldview of conspiracy theories, their tendency to distinguish the world in good and evil, as his Barkun's third criterion is everything is connected, whereas Cubitt's is dualism, so the strict binary between the good people, the victims of the conspiracy, and the bad people, the alleged conspirators. It actually took me quite a while to figure out why they differ on that. And I think that the difference is connected to the fact that Barkun has contemporary conspiracy theories in mind as his model. So he's writing at the beginning of the 21st century, and he's looking past into the past for a couple of decades, but mainly focusing on the 1990s and most recent developments. And what he identifies about these recent developments is the rise of what he calls super conspiracy theories. That is, conspiracy theories that link different actors and scenarios together. So the Jews and the Illuminati and the European Union and the communists all have joined forces to further their plot. Cubitt, by contrast, is focused on the 19th century. So he's an expert on 19th century France. And at this time, such super conspiracy theories were far less popular, if they even existed at that time, which is why he doesn't highlight everything is connected. But what he highlights is this dualism, the strict distinction between good and evil. And that also the distinction, the difference in these two definitions then already should alert us to the fact that conspiracy theories evolve over time, and that while it might be possible to identify certain ingredients, but that what we call conspiracy theory is by no means always the same thing. And that, of course, we always need to take this into account when we tell the history of conspiracy theories. I want, however, to begin here with the history of conspiracy theory research, and only then move into what I think is what we know at the moment about the history of conspiracy theories as such. So we'll start on the meta level and then turn to the phenomenon, and the reason for that hopefully will become clear. For many people, research into conspiracy theories begins in the 1960s with Richard Hofstadter's classic essay on the paranoid style in American politics, in which he never uses the term conspiracy theory, but constantly talks about them and links them to famously and problematically to paranoia. However, this is by no means the beginning of the scholarly engagement with conspiracy theories. I think the earliest study ever done on the subject, however, a study that also did not use the term conspiracy theory because it was not really in circulation back then, is Vernon Stauffer's 1918 book on the New England and the Bavarian Illuminati. So what he's writing about is the so-called Illuminati scare of the 1790s, when people, Jedediah Morse, John Adams, and a couple of others came to the conviction that the Illuminati, after having caused the French Revolution in Europe, now had crossed the Atlantic and were trying to destroy the newly founded American Republic. Stauffer's book is kind of timeless in that he was very careful in assembling the sources and interpreting the sources. And even though we now know much more about how conspiracy theories function, it's still worth reading what he put together. But this kind of remained an outlier, and there might be others from around the same time or maybe even earlier that address the topic of conspiracy theory without ever using the term, and that have flown mostly under the radar so far. If we want to identify the moment where research in conspiracy theories begins more systematically, the moment we need to turn to is the 1940s and 1950s in the United States. So the following couple of slides and the following couple of minutes, what I'm saying is mostly based on an article that I co-wrote with Peter Knight for Joe Ushinsky's volume on conspiracy theories and the people who believe in them, where we basically gave a broad overview of the development of conspiracy theory research. We know by now that Hofstadter, writing in 1964, is basically not the beginning of one specific period in research on conspiracy theories, but it is rather the end, because there were people coming, people before Hofstadter, also historians or social scientists, sociologists, political scientists, who began to engage with the topic of conspiracy theories. This begins in the 1940s already, and then continues throughout the 1950s, and then in the 60s, it kind of culminates in Hofstadter's article on the paranoid style. Broadly speaking, these scholars approach conspiracy theories from two different perspectives. On the one hand, and I'm speaking in very, very broad terms here, there is what you could call the Adorno or the Frankfurt School of conspiracy theory research. This is mostly German scholars of German origin who are in the United States in exile during World War II and in the years afterwards remain there, and who are looking at Europe and especially at Germany, and who begin to engage with the topic of conspiracy theory because they consider them extremely problematic and dangerous, because what's happening in Europe demonstrates what effects conspiracy theories can have. So Adorno writes The Authoritarian Personality, in which, by the way, he uses the term paranoid style. We don't really know if Hofstadter got it from there, but it's a fair chance that he did. And people like other scholars like Leo Löwenthal, for example, he teams up with Norbert Gutermann and they write Prophets of Deceit, in which they also engage with the topic of how authoritarian personalities use conspiracy theories in order to manipulate the masses. So that would be the first strand of research that we have at that time, the argument that conspiracy theories are dangerous. The other is one that we would more connect with somebody like Karl Popper, who in The Open Society and Its Enemies not only coins the term conspiracy theory in its modern meaning when he speaks of the conspiracy theory of society, but who basically makes the argument that conspiracy theories are just bad explanations of social reality because they overemphasize intentions and intentional action and underestimate unintended consequences and systemic effects and structural logics. So these two ideas, conspiracy theories are bad explanations and conspiracy theories are dangerous, are during the 40s and early 50s mainly circulating in the ivory tower of American universities. They don't really make it into the general public. This only then happens with a generation of American scholars, Seymour Martin Lipsetz, Edward Shields, picking up on these ideas in the 1950s and applying them to what's happening in the United States at that time. And the reason why I go into so much detail here is that many of the things that still shape the public discourse about conspiracy theories, that they are linked to authoritarianism, that they are linked to extremism, that they are linked to populism, that they are always dangerous, are the result of the body of work done in exactly these years. And very often people are no longer aware of that, but the associations basically have stayed. So people like Shields popularized these ideas. Samuel Lipstadt does the same, and then it all culminates in Hofstadter, who one could say marries these two traditions that I've just outlined by, in his term, the paranoid style. So conspiracy theories now are considered inadequate explanations of reality, and they are also considered to be highly problematic and dangerous. A dangerous cry from the margin, I think, is Hofstadter's famous phrase. There are, of course, in the 70s and 80s, historians who continue this work, but we can't really talk of a moment or wave in conspiracy theory studies in that regard. So for a long time, conspiracy theories fly mostly under the radar. During the 70s and 80s, they are not really that much engaged with, and it's only really during the 1990s that we see more systematic research efforts emerging again. So since the early 1990s, quantitative research in psychology and political science has begun to take up the topic. Ted Goertzel, an American psychologist, is one of the earliest scholars in that regard. I've just given you a couple of prominent names here. Karen Douglas, who I think will also be speaking in this series later on, Roland Imhoff, who's probably the best and most prominent German psychologist working on the topic, Jan Willem van Prooijen. And then, of course, if you turn to political science, people like Joe Ushinsky in the United States. What unites all of this research is that this is a research that that employs purely quantitative methods in order to identify the personality types of people that are drawn to conspiracy theories. So we learn that people who feel powerless and people who are bad at dealing with insecurity and ambiguity embrace conspiracy theories more than others. This kind of research is also interested in identifying socio-demographic factors. So we learn, for example, from this huge body of research, and this is by far the biggest body of research that is being produced at the moment, this branch here, we learn that that education has an impact on conspiracy theories, that the tendency to believe in conspiracy theories declines with the degree of formal education. When it comes to gender, these studies are less unambiguous. Some studies find that men believe in conspiracy theories just as much as women. Many other studies, and this would be supported by qualitative research, find that men tend to believe significantly more in conspiracy theories than women, at least as long as it does not come to medical conspiracy theories, where these differences disappear again then. So this is a research tradition that is still going on, that begins in the 1990s and has continued since then. I now come to another one that I will not say a lot about, because this is actually a context of the discipline that is hosting us here, so analytical philosophy, and this is also the one that I don't really know that much about. This is also something that begins in the mid-1990s, where analytical philosophers begin to approach the topic of conspiracy theory, trying to find out if there is something that distinguishes conspiracy theories from other theories, trying to come up with criteria, for example, that allow you to distinguish between warranted and unwarranted conspiracy theories. And this is a field that I've mostly been observing from a distance, where there seems to be even more disagreement than in other branches of scholarship that engage with conspiracy theories. So, for example, the work by Lee Basham and Matthew Dentith takes a rather benevolent approach to the topic, and philosophers like Juha Räikä, for example, won't have any of that, and usually then tend to write against that. And finally, and here I can say more again, because this is something that I'm far more familiar with, since the late 1990s, there has been a systematic body of research in literary and cultural studies, especially American studies, especially in the early years, cultural history and anthropology, that has engaged with the topic of conspiracy theory. So at the turn from the 20th to the 21st century, there is something like a really significant moment when the books by Peter Knight, Tim Melley, and Mark Fenster all come out at almost exactly the same moment, and they have a lot in common, but they also make very different arguments about especially American conspiracy theories. Peter Knight highlighting the idea of a conspiracy, of a culture of conspiracy in which paranoia under the conditions of postmodernity has largely been normalized. Tim Melley highlighting the idea of agency panic, describing very convincingly how conspiracy theories allow you to cling to a rather traditional notion of the subject at exactly the moment of time when this notion of the subject is coming under attack. And Mark Fenster somehow been all over the place, writing about the connection to populism that I wasn't really interested in when I first read his book 15 years ago, but that now is absolutely central to what I'm doing, identifying the narrative features and interpretive strategies of conspiracy theories and so on. A couple of years later, there's Claire Birchall's book on Knowledge Goes Pop, where she looks at conspiracy theories in the digital age for the first time in a systematic fashion. And I think Claire is also going to speak in this series of lectures later on in the semester. Then there are historical studies by people like Catherine Olmsted, people like Klaus Oberhauser, an Austrian historian, and then also my book that was mentioned earlier in 2014, and Katharina Thalmann's book that I will say more about, that came out 2 years ago. These are just examples because there's a large body of research now. One has to say that since the 2000s, research on conspiracy theories really has exploded. So I'm only giving you some highlights here with a certain bias towards studies by American scholars and on the United States, and studies by German-speaking scholars. What unites all of these books I would say, is the attempt not to pathologize conspiracy theories, to move beyond this Hofstadterian paradigm and to take conspiracy theories seriously as ways of understanding the world, as ways of creating collective identity, and also as narratives. So Mark Fenster has an excellent discussion of what is good and what is bad about Hofstadter, and he makes the point that if you take the term paranoid style, the paranoid is highly problematic, but Hofstadter's highlighting of style is something that literary and cultural studies, especially, of course, could pick up on because it allowed them to talk about metaphors, tropes, imagery, and narrative structures. One could add another slide to this enumeration here and could say that since 2020, basically everyone seems to be working on conspiracy theories because the pandemic has made the field really explode. I was for a couple of years vice chair of the cost action comparative analysis of conspiracy theories, and on our website, to which I can post the link in the chat later on, we have a bibliography of work done on conspiracy theories, which we regularly updated over the past couple of years, and it runs to 100 pages in very small print. But we have now updated it for the final time because since last year, so many studies have come out that it is virtually impossible to keep an overview, even if you're well familiar with the field as such. So over the last year, research has really exploded, and there are interesting things that will come out of that that I can't even dare to think about yet. Still, even with all this research being done at the moment, there are significant gaps in what we know about conspiracy theories. We still don't really have a systematic account of the impact of the internet on conspiracy theories and the communities that they beget. We have only a few ethnographic studies of conspiracy theorists, mostly for the reason that conspiracy theorists very often do not like talking to researchers. And of course, research ethics these days, for very good reasons, require you to reveal yourself when you're entering these communities, be it online or be it offline, which is why the ethnographic studies that we have so far were mostly written by journalists. Jonathan Kay's book about the 9/11 truth movement that came out 10 years ago, Anna Merlin's book about the Republic of Doubt, I think it is called, that came out 2 years ago in German, Tobias Ginsburg's book Reise ins Reich, where he spent a couple of months undercover in the German Reichsbürger milieu. And while all of these journalistic works offer you valuable insights, you can also tell that they very often reproduce stereotypes, very often going back to stereotypes produced by this first wave of research in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that they lack the nuanced understanding of conspiracy theory that would be necessary to make things even more interesting. We also know amazingly little about conspiracy theories outside the Western world. There is not a lot of work being done yet on African countries, on Asian cultures. Even South America has not been really well researched in that regard. And apart maybe from the United States, where we have fairly comprehensive accounts, we also don't know a lot about the history of conspiracy theories yet, especially once we move beyond the Western world. So fairly comprehensive on the United States, a couple of very good studies on Europe. Some countries have been well researched, certain conspiracy theories, certain periods have been well researched, but there's still blank spaces on our on the map there. But once you move outside of these regions, it becomes really terra incognita. So for example, there is no single account of the history of conspiracy theories in Arab or Muslim countries before the 1950s. We don't know, for example, if there are even conspiracy theories in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, or if they only emerged then over the course of the 18th or 19th century. That would be the thesis of some scholars I talked to through the contact with the European powers. So if you're a student and if you're looking for a topic to do your PhD on with regard to conspiracy theories outside of analytical philosophy, there I cannot tell you what the interesting questions are at the moment and the research discussions, then this might give you some idea. Okay, and with that I move on to, well, it's not the history, but the history of conspiracy theories. Something that I didn't mention is that at the end of the 1990s, there are a couple of collected volumes published in German by scholars like Ute Kaumanns and Matthias Niendorf that are implicitly governed by the idea that conspiracy theories are an anthropological gift, that conspiracy theories basically exist in all cultures and societies. This is something that most scholars don't believe anymore. But as I said, we still lack a comprehensive account of the history of conspiracy theory. So everything that I'm telling you is, especially when it comes to the time before the 18th century, very sketchy. We know that there are things that at least come close to what we would call conspiracy theories, and that could be described using the definitions that I gave you earlier already in antiquity, in ancient Athens and in Rome. So, and we know that from two very good monographs by Victoria Pagan and Joseph Roismans that are well worth reading. They are two, as far as I know, however, basically the only people who have written about this so far with regard to antiquity. Another branch of research that has made a point of giving you a longer diachronic perspective is, of course, people working in anti-Semitism studies. And a few people have argued that there's a long continuity of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories reaching from the High Middle Ages in the 11th and 12th century to the very present moment. There are, however, other scholars who have contested that for very good reasons and who have argued that conspiracy theories did not exist in the Middle Ages, at least not in the form that we associate with them today, and that is captured by the definitions that I gave you at the beginning of this talk. Most thoroughly, this argument has been made by a German historian, Cornel Zwierlein, in a very thick and dense and interesting essay on the emerging European state system in the 15th and 16th century that was published in the journal Historical Social Research a couple of years ago. There, Zwierlein basically argues that conspiracy theories in their modern form emerge during the early modern period, because that is the moment where the European political landscape becomes so complicated that it just becomes appears convincing to people that there are dark forces pulling the strings, while at the same time because of the emergence of print, we get something like what he calls a reading public, in which texts that make conspiracist accusations can circulate. And because, of course, with the early modern period, we see the emergence of a specific notion of the human subject that ascribes a certain notion of agency and a certain understanding of time to human beings, all of which he considers preconditions for conspiracy theories to exist. I don't think that this is the last word on the emergence of conspiracy theories, and you can always make a case that it's very difficult to distinguish between the early modern period and the late Middle Ages. So other people have then by now argued that, well, if you look at the 14th century and certain accusations made against Jews in the context of the plague hitting Europe, we find everything that Zwierlein describes already. So the jury's still out of that, but the the consensus among most scholars with historical interest is at the moment that conspiracy theories emerge somewhere at the transition between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And the interesting thing is, and this is why I put my book up there, because it's basically, I think, the argument that came out of that and a couple of studies that build on that, is that no matter if you read Sweerlein on the early modern period, or if you read Cubitt on 19th century France, or if you read Bernard Bailyn on 18th century United States, or if you read other people on the French Revolution, like Klaus Oberhauser and the conspiracy theories that it begot, what they all highlight implicitly is something that runs counter to what people like Hofstadter assume. People like Hofstadter argued that conspiracy theories had always been a minority phenomenon prior to the 1950s and 60s and were only now moving to the mainstream. And in many ways, they're writing against that. What historians who have looked at previous centuries mostly agree on by now is that it was completely normal to believe in conspiracy theories for a very, very long time. That conspiracy theories were basically what the sociology of knowledge would call orthodox knowledge, and that it's a rather recent development that they turned into heterodox knowledge. So when I set out to write my book on the history of American conspiracy theories in 2008, my working hypothesis was that I wanted to show that conspiracy theories had in the past been just as popular and influential as people like Peter Knight, Tim Melley, and Mark Fenster argued they had become after 1960. So I wanted to highlight continuity. They have always been very important and always been very influential. The argument that eventually came out of the book was that I argued that they had been far more popular and influential prior to the 1960s, and that one reason why they had become so visible after the 1960s was that they had changed from orthodox to heterodox knowledge. They were considered a problem because of the research of people like Adorno, Hofstadter, Löwenthal, Shields, and others. They were now considered a problem, they were considered dangerous, and therefore they were so visible and were so much talked about as conspiracy theories. Whereas people in the 18th and 19th century don't really talk about conspiracy theories, but they all believe in conspiracy theories. They're not worried about the harmful effects of conspiracy theories, but what they're worried about is actually the harmful effect of conspiracies. And in my book, for example, I traced this through the through American history. I looked, for example, at conspiracy theories about slavery in the antebellum period in the 1850s. And what you find there is, and historians had known that for decades, but they had never linked it to the concept of conspiracy theory, that, for example, people like Abraham Lincoln actively spread conspiracy theories. They thought that the so-called slave power had captured all government institutions. So in his, in order to extend slavery everywhere and maybe even to enslave the white working classes. So in his famous 1858 speech about a house divided, Abraham Lincoln accuses the current president, the former president, the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, and an influential Democratic member of Congress of having orchestrated all the events of the 1850s in order to facilitate the introduction of slavery everywhere in the nation. We all know the first two paragraphs from this speech: a house divided upon itself cannot stand, but we don't know that about 80% of the speech are devoted to developing this conspiracy theory, because we usually don't associate someone like Lincoln with conspiracy theories. Likewise, and Bernard Bailyn had already shown that during the 1960s in his book on the ideological origins of the American Revolution, is quite clear that people like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson believed in conspiracy theories prior to the American Revolution and then later on during the Illuminati scare. So conspiracy theories were believed by political leaders, they were believed by spiritual leaders, they were believed by leading intellectuals of the 18th and 19th century like Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, and many, many others. You find them in mainstream newspapers, you find them in sermons, you find them in pamphlets. Everywhere people talk about plots, designs, and schemes. So it was perfectly normal. People didn't problematize this. They were worried about who was conspiring and not about the harmful effects of conspiracy theories. If you look at Europe, the picture isn't any different. So if you look at the studies by Cubitt on the Jesuits in 19th century France, if you look at the books about the aftermath of the French Revolution or what's happening in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, conspiracy theories are everywhere and they are perfectly normal. When I do the German version of this talk, I always have a quote from Thomas Mann's Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen, where he accuses the Illuminati and the Freemasons of having orchestrated the First World War. For the English version, I usually use this excerpt from a speech by Winston Churchill from 1920, where he talks about a sinister confederacy of international Jews, mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all of them, have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt, so he is turning Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Order of the Illuminati in the 18th century, into a Jew here, at least implicitly, in order to create a long historical lineage from the 18th century to the present in which he is speaking, to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as a modern writer, Mrs. Webster has so ably shown, a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. So what Churchill is doing here is that he gives you as his source Helen Nestor Webster, an British aristocrat who first wrote historical novels about the French Revolution before she began to develop conspiracy theories about the French Revolution. And her role in the development of 20th century conspiracy theories cannot be overestimated, because she's basically the one who, after a couple of decades, resuscitates the Illuminati, who during the 19th century had often been blamed for causing the French Revolution. And she links them in what can be seen as the first super conspiracy theory in Bakunin's terms to the communists and to the Jews. So she's a notorious conspiracy theorist, and arguably the greatest British statesman of the 20th century is referring quite favorably to her here. By the way, Nestor Webster also had a huge correspondence with Ezra Pound, and their letters have never really been systematically looked at. They are in the Pound archive in Brazil, I think, and that would also be a valuable research project to look at this and to see how she maybe influenced Pound, and if maybe Pound influenced her and gave her some of these conspiracist ideas. I'll stop reading out the quote here. I think I've made the point that even someone like Churchill early in the 20th century spreads conspiracy theories because it is just normal. This is how people thought the world worked. Then through the work of people like Edward Shields, Karl Popper, Theodor Adorno, Leo Löwenthal, Seymour Martin Lipstadt, and Richard Hofstadter, and the public impact that these engagements with conspiracy theory have, conspiracy theories in the United States during the 50s and 60s really move from the mainstream to the margins of society. People are no longer concerned now about conspiracies, but they are worried about the harmful effects of conspiracy theories, how they might lead to radicalization and how they might be a danger to democracy. And if this sounds familiar, then of course, because this is the debate that we are still having. This process of the stigmatization of conspiracy theory that turns them from accepted knowledge into what Barkun calls stigmatized knowledge, but Barkun assumes they have always been stigmatized knowledge, has been traced in detail by Katharina Thalmann in a book that came out in 2019, where she really writes about how the ideas of Popper and Adorno traveled to Shields and Lipset and from there to Hofstadter, and how they gained more and more public traction. And what was also important at this time, of course, is that more and more Americans, because of the GI Bill, attended college and came into contact with these social science takes on the topic of conspiracy theory. And this, Thalmann argues, also led to the fact that conspiracy theories became so quickly marginalized and stigmatized in American culture. From everything that we know about conspiracy theories in Germany or in France or in Sweden, where this process has not at all been systematically studied so far, it is safe to assume that it must have been a very similar process, that really the impact of the social sciences on the stigmatization of conspiracy theories is important after World War II, and especially in the 50s and 60s. And one indicator to corroborate that hypothesis, and it's really not more than a hypothesis at the moment, is that once we go to Central and Eastern Europe, the situation is very different. I'm directing a project at the moment that looks at populism and conspiracy theory, among others, in Hungary and Poland. And what we find there is that conspiracy theories are extremely normal, that they are not at all stigmatized as they are stigmatized in Germany or Italy or France. And one way of explaining that would, of course, be the weakness of the social sciences in those communist countries after 1945, where disciplines like sociology were for a long time oppressed or non-existent because they were considered bourgeois pseudosciences that should not be put into competition with the pure Marxist doctrine. So you see, it gets shaky because we don't really have a lot of research on that yet, but we can assume just from the status of conspiracy theories in German culture today and from the status that they must have had 100 years ago, that a similar process took place and in other countries as well. And this argument that conspiracy theories have really moved from the mainstream to the margins in the second half of the 20th century is also borne out by the more quantitative approach that Joe Ushinsky and Joe Perrin take in their book on American conspiracy theories that came out in 2014, where they also at one point quite explicitly say the data suggest one telling fact: we do not live in an age of conspiracy theories and have not for some time. And interestingly enough, the moment where their data starts to change is in the 1960s. That is exactly at that moment which Thalmann, coming from a very different angle and with a very different approach, also identifies as the turning point in when it comes to the status of American conspiracy theories. Now, you could very well say, but what about the president? What about Donald Trump? And what about conspiracy theories on Fox News? And here, of course, I think things get shakier because we don't really have too many clear accounts of that yet. But what we can say, I think, is that mostly because of the internet, when it comes to Germany and other European countries, and a couple of other factors when it comes to the United States that I won't go into now, we have seen an increasing polarization and fragmentation of society, which basically leads to a situation where we have one part of the public still worrying about conspiracy theories, and another part increasingly worrying again about conspiracies. In Germany, the part of the public that worries about conspiracies and that considers them legitimate orthodox knowledge again is much smaller than in the United States. In the United States, it is bigger, and it is, of course, supported by news outlets, more traditional news outlets, whereas in Germany, the alternative media that highlight conspiracy theories are all internet-based and don't really have that much reach. And of course, if you looked at quantitative studies, you would also find differences there. You would find that if you look at the study by Oliver and Wood from 2014, that every second American believes in at least one conspiracy theory, whereas only 1/3 of the German population displays what psychologists call a conspiracy mentality. That is a general tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. And of that third, it's only 1/3 again, so 10 to 12% of the population that really organize their identities and lives around conspiracy theories. Yeah, this image we don't need, because I already talked about the fragmentation of society that we can observe in this regard in all Western countries at the very moment. And someone who also has some very interesting thoughts about the status of conspiracy theory in the present would be Katharina Thalmann, who writes in the conclusion of her book on the stigmatization of conspiracy theory that conspiracy theory remains illegitimate, but that might not matter anymore in a time where the internet and other changes in communication systems allow even illegitimate heterodox content to be spread very widely. So during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, for example, it was very difficult for conspiracy theorists to find larger audiences. The internet, of course, has made this all much easier. Conspiracy theories are far more available again, far more visible. And if they're more available, then of course more people probably believe in them again, and these people link up with other people. They form online communities where they reassure themselves in their convictions and also might mobilize each other. I think a good way to sum up the status of conspiracy theories in American culture at the moment is if we look at what happened in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, where Trump's constant conspiracy theorizing convinced a significant number of Americans, and of course, especially Republicans, that the election was rigged and that Biden won unfairly, and that there had been a widespread conspiracy, that there had been large-scale voter fraud. So conspiracy theories have made a comeback, we could say then, in the United States more than in other Western countries, in that more and more people find their claims convincing again. At the same time, of course, even in the United States, most institutions still consider conspiracy theories utter nonsense. So all of the lawsuits that Trump's lawyers filed in the aftermath of the election, and where the evidence that they presented for election fraud was all based on conspiracy theories, were very quickly thrown out by the courts again. So you could say that in the United States these days, conspiracy theories have made a comeback and are convincing to a fair amount of people. So you could win with them in a court of public opinion, but you cannot yet win again in a court of law, because in these positions, people usually don't believe in conspiracy theories, not yet, one might say, pessimistically. In Germany, of course, the situation is very different. Conspiracy theorists in Germany are also vocal. They take to the streets protesting against the corona measures, but this is really a minority of people, and it is also not supported by politicians who have any kind of influence. There's only one party in Germany that regularly picks up on these conspiracy theories and tries to unite the different protesters under their umbrella, and that is the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany. But they are at about 12 to 14% in national polls and nowhere near governing anywhere. So whereas conspiracy theories are, I think, a serious problem for American democracy at the moment. They're also a serious problem for democracy in Hungary and Poland at the moment. In Germany, we are still in a slightly better position, at least for the time being. So what to take from that? Conspiracy theories have a long history. And throughout much of that history, they were even more important and influential than they are now in the present, even though things might have started to change again over the past 10 to 20 years. Thank you.